Hello and welcome. I'm Dave. Today we will learn about working with files in Python, and I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. I've got VS Code open and I have a new folder for lesson 22 over here on the left. Notice 3 files. I've got names, more names, and context. And inside of these files, I've really just got the same thing, 4 names, 1 on each line. And you'll see why we are using those. We just need some text files to work with as we learn about working with files in Python. So let's create a new file in our file tree, and we'll call this files.py. I'd like to introduce an acronym, and it's called R.A.W.X, R-A.W.X. And this stands for read, append, write, and create. You may have heard of the acronym CRUD before, and this is very similar, which CRUD is create, read, update, delete. But here we have read, append, which means the same thing as update, write, and create. We will also learn how to delete files as we go, but first we'll cover these 4 operations. So the first one, R, is read, and we'll start with that. Now, if a file doesn't exist and we attempt to open it, we will get an error. So I'll put error if it doesn't exist, just as a note here inside of our code for you. Now, let's go ahead and open one of these files we have in our file tree, and we'll just abbreviate the file with the letter F. You see this fairly common. You could write the word file if you want to. Either way, it's going to hold the file and we can work with it. So we'll say open, and then inside of parentheses, I'll just say names, an S, if I spell it correctly, .text, and this will open the file. But this has some defaults that we are not seeing, and these are essentially what these are, what we want to do with the file. So if I put a comma here and then put an R for read, that's the same thing. It's still going to read the text file. And if you really get into working with files, you can even specify if it is, for example, a text file with a T or a binary file with a B. We'll just be working with text files, and that's probably what you'll do the most often. So that's what I'll focus on today. And we don't really have to specify that. It's going to just have a default value for the files as T for text. It also defaults to read if we don't specify that. So really, we don't have to put the comma and the R there. And then it knows we just want to open this file in order to read it. So now that we've opened the file, let's go ahead and print the contents. So I'm going to say print, and I'll just say f.read and call that method on the file. And now let's go ahead and run our code. So I will choose run Python file, and we get the contents of the file. It just says Dave, Jane, Eddie, and Jimmy. And of course, all the files have that same content. I'd like to move this over to the right as we have in the past. So let's go to View and then Appearance. Then we come down to Panel Position and choose the right side. And now we'll see our code run over here. I'll still keep this open when I can, or maybe toggle it with Control B. You can close it and reopen that file tree if we want to see what files we have over here. Now we should note we don't have to read the entire file, so I'm going to copy this down so you can see both examples. And now let's say I just want to read the first 4 characters of the file. So I'm going to pass in the number 4 to the read method. I'll run this once again, and we should see just the first 4 characters, but we see everything, and that's because we already read the file. So now we're at the end of the file, so you understand kind of how that works. So let me comment this out. Now let's once again do the F, which is file.read, and just get the first 4 characters, which should just be my name, Dave. I'll run the file once again, and now we only have Dave as the output. Okay, I'm going to comment out that line as well, and let's look at another example where we maybe want to read the entire line. We don't know that there's only 4 letters on the first line or 6 letters on the third line, and we just want to read the first line of the file. So I'm going to once again use print so you can see what it does. And instead of read, I'm going to use read line. And this is going to read the first line of the file. So save and run the code, and we once again get Dave. But if I stack this now with Shift Alt and the down arrow, I recreated that line. Do you think we'll get Dave twice? Will it read the first line twice? Or maybe it will go to the second line. Let's save the file with Control S, run the code, and find out. it went to the second line, and notice there's a space between now, which is different than when we were reading the entire file. So that is also worth noting, that you can read one line, then move to the next. So notice when you're reading a file, just like I showed before where I had to comment this out up here, when you're reading a file, it moves through the file. You'll eventually get to the end of the file. So now I'll comment both of these out as well, so I can highlight these and do Control and the slash, and that will comment them both out. Now what I want to do is loop through each line of the file and print those lines. So that looks a little different. Let's say 4x, and this would just be we could say 4 lines. So let's just say that 4 line in F, which is our file. Then we're going to go ahead and print the line. Now this should loop through and print each line. Let's find out when we Control S to save and run our code once again. And yes, it did. It was just like doing f.readLine, and of course we printed each one here. So very similar, but this is a little more concise and fairly easy to use. Now, after we opened a file like this, where we have F as an open file, we should always close it when we're finished. And to do that, we just say f.close. And now we won't see a difference here, but it is important to close those files because it could be that you change something in the file, but that change is not going to show up really until you close the file, and then you wanted to reopen it, then you could see that change. So let's go ahead and run this code again, and you'll see the same output, but now we've closed the file, and that's important. Every time we've opened a file, then we do something with it, then we should close that file. Now notice the file names we have over here on the left. We have names, more names, and context. So I'm going to try to open a file that we do not have. So I'll press Control B now so we can have just a little more room here. But I want to show what you should do to avoid an error. And we've already learned this. We should use a try block. And then inside this block, we could say F equals and open. Now this could be the name of any file that doesn't exist. So I'll just say name list.txt. And then after that, I'm going to say print f.read. So I want to print the contents, but I am making a mistake because this file doesn't exist. So it might cause an error, or it will cause an error actually because it doesn't exist. So let's also print and say the file you want to read doesn't exist. Nice little bit of a long message, but a nice message to explain what's going on. And then we can use our finally block, and this comes in handy because this allows us to go ahead and close the file, because remember we opened it before, or we tried to open it before we had an error. So if we don't open it at all, we'll of course have the error. But say the file did exist, this would allow us to open it, do something with it, and in the finally block, we could call close. So it's a nice structure for that operation. Let's go ahead and save. Now let's run the code. And we get the file you want to read doesn't exist. So what if it did exist? If we had our names.txt. Now let's save and run this again. And now we printed the contents of that file, rather than getting our error message, the file you want to read doesn't exist. We are now ready to move on to appending to files. That means adding to files. So I'll just paste this in. It says append. It creates the file if it doesn't exist. So that's important to know also. Say we try to open a file that doesn't exist, but we're opening it to append to it. Well, it's going to create the file anyway. So here I'm just going to say F equals now open, and I'm going to open my names.txt file once again. Now I'm going to say this is to append. So we need to pass in what we're doing with this file. By default, remember, it's read. So we didn't need to put in the comma and then the R in quotes, but here we need the A for append. Now I'm going to say f.write, and I'm going to write something new to the file. I'll add a fifth name, and that name is Neil, then f.close. So now I've added to the file, but we are not really seeing what's in that file yet. So let's go ahead and now read the file as well. So I'm going to copy all of this down. I'll highlight everything, do Shift Alt and the down arrow. I'll create one line here in between. Now I'm going to open this to read so I can get rid of the A. And now instead of the f.write, I want f.close. read, and I'm not going to try to pass anything into the read. I'm going to want to print what we're reading, so I see the new contents. Then we're going to close the file. So we're appending to the file here by adding a fifth name. Then we're going to go ahead and open the file and read it, and then once again close it. So now let's run the code. I'll scroll so we're way down here at the bottom to our prompt. Run the code. And so we had our 4 names, then we appended to the file. When we opened it back up and read it again, we had our 5 names. And now we can even go to our names file and we can see Neil has been added on the 5th line of our file. Okay, now you've already seen the write method here as I used it to write the name Neil to the end of the file on that 5th line. However, you haven't seen how we open a file for writing. So let's do that now with write. And really, I'm going to put in parentheses here, overwrite, because we will overwrite whatever is in the file that we open. So I'm going to say f equals open. Now I'm going to open my context.txt file, and I'm going to pass in the W that stands for write. Now when we do this, we'll go ahead and write something else to the file. But just to confirm, let's look at that context.txt file. You can see that it has the 4 names in here that we started each file with. So this is in our context.txt. Now let me go back to files. Now let's write something else to that file as well. So after this, I'm going to say f.write, which is not the same as opening a file for writing, because remember, we were able to open a file to append to it, and we still used the write method. So now we're going to use the write method as we opened a file to write to it, and this will overwrite everything in the file. I'm going to write, I deleted all of the context. And yeah, let's just leave it at that. That's a fairly simple statement. So that's what will now be in the file instead of those 4 names. So now I'll say f.close, and we've closed the file. Now once again, we're going to want to read this file to confirm that what we actually put in it is there. So I'll copy what we had above, and now I'll paste this in, and we're going to change this to read the context.txt file and then print what it finds inside the file. So now let's run our code again, and we have I should have said deleted. I deleted all of the context. So that's what was in the file. Let me change that to deleted, or that's going to bother me. Let's look at the context file itself. And yes, it says I delete all of the context. So I'll have to run that again. Notice what also happened when we ran the code again. We added Neil one more time to our names.txt file. So now it has Dave, Jane, Eddie, Jimmy, Neil. So every time we run this code right now, we're going to add another Neil to our names.txt. And it might also be important to note that it didn't put that on another new line because we didn't put in a line break. So if we wanted Neil to go to a new line, we would also want to put in a new line character with our /n as we added that name to the end of the file. And now let's look at a couple of ways we can create a new file. So I'll put a comment here and say 2 ways to create a new file. And each way has its own plus or minus, depending on how you look at it. It kind of just depends what you need. So here, I'm going to say this opens a file for writing. So you know we're going to use the W, that permission. And then we're going to say this also creates the file if it does not exist. And I'm going to press Alt-Z so that wraps down to the next line, just so we can see that. And now I'll say f equals open, and I'm going to name a file that doesn't exist. I'm going to say name_list.txt, and we're going to pass in the write permission. So this is going to open a file for writing, but if we specify a file that doesn't exist, it's going to go ahead and create the file. So after we do that, I'll just put f.close. We're not really going to add anything to the file, but let's see what happens when we run the code. We updated our statement here. But let's check the file tree to see if we have this new file. And if we look over here, we now have a name_list.txt file. We didn't write anything to the file, but we opened it for writing, and we specified the file even when it didn't exist, so it was created. Now, the second way to create a new file could also cause an error. So I'm going to hide the file tree so we have a little more room. And let me put a note with this. I'll say creates the specified file, but returns an error if the file exists. So if we're trying to create a file that already exists, this will return an error. So we kind of need to check before we try to create the file. So to do that, we need to import OS, and we're going to use that when we delete a file as well. So let's import OS here at the top of our file. Now let's scroll back down where we were, and on line 54, I'm going to say if not os.path.exists. Now I can check to see if a file exists or not. So I'm going to say if a file named dave.txt does not exist, and that's what it means when we say if not, and then we're checking this. So if the file dave.txt does not exist, then I'm going to say f equals open, and we'll pass in dave.txt, and then we'll open it with x, which remember means create. Then I'm just going to say f close. Now this should create a file named dave.txt. So let's look at the file tree as well, so we'll be able to see it show up over here. And we've saved the code. Let's go ahead and run that code. And now we have a file named dave.txt. We didn't put anything in the file, but we did create it. Now we could change this out as well. So if you wanted to put in a file name like context.txt, then it would say if it doesn't exist, create it. You shouldn't get an error because it already exists, so it shouldn't try to create it. Now I'm going to hide the file tree, and let's use some similar logic here as we delete this file, or we delete a couple of files that we don't need. So I'm going to put delete a file here. Now here I'm going to say we can avoid an error if it doesn't exist. And to do so, this looks very similar. We'll just say if os.path.exists. So notice now we're not saying if not, we're saying if it does exist. Now, what did we already create over here? We've got a file with my name, dave.txt, and we've also got a names or name_list.txt. If I remember right, yes, that didn't have anything in it either. So we could delete one or both of those if we want to here, for example. So I'm going to say if dave.txt exists, then we're going to do something. So now we'll just go ahead and say os.remove, and then we'll pass in the name of the file, dave.txt, and we'll remove that file. But we should put an else. So we can put else, and then we can say print, and then here we'll say the file you wish to delete does not exist. So that would say, okay, if the dave.txt file does not exist, then we're going to get this message. So let's go ahead and run this code, and we'll see what happens. And we've got I deleted all of the content here at the end, so it must have deleted the dave.txt file. We can verify that by looking at our file tree, and that file is indeed gone. Now you could do the same thing and put in the name_list.txt and delete that as well if you want to, because we're not really using that file either. Okay, we have covered the operations I wanted to show you, but there is one more thing. Let's scroll back up to the top quickly and just recap here. We've looked at reading files, appending files, writing to files, creating files, and of course, we also applied some checks like our try, except, finally. But I want to show you a way that people work with files, and they don't use the try, except, finally. Instead, they have some implicit exception handling, and it makes this a little more concise yet. So let's look at the with keyword, and I'll do this here at the bottom. So I'm just going to say with open, and now let's open our more_names.txt file, and we'll say as f. So once again, f represents the file, but this is just phrased differently. It says with open as f. Now that we've done that, we can just say the content here equals f.read. And that's not new. Before we were just printing f.read, and now we're just storing it inside of our content variable. Now after that, let's go ahead and say with open, and we can have another file. Let's look at what's inside of our files first. So names has all of these names. Notice we've written Neil a couple of times now on new lines because we had the new line character. Before we put in that new line character, we had 3 Neils on one line. But when this started out, it looked like our more names file with just these 4 names. So maybe we want to put our names file back to that. We can read the content out of more names and then write it to names so we get it to look just like more names, essentially copying the file. So to do that, let's go ahead and now say with, I'll hide the file tree again so we have some room here. I'll say with open names.txt, and this is also going to be as f. And now inside of this with, we'll say f.write, and we're going to write that content that we stored. So let's go ahead and do this, and then we'll look at those files again. So I'll run the code, and I got an error because I wasn't thinking. I was too quick, and what happened was this defaults to open because it's a read. We didn't specify. Here, we need to go ahead and say we're going to open this for writing. So we're going to overwrite what's in the file. So we needed to pass in that W out of our R.A.W.X acronym. So that W stands for opening the file as writing. So now we should be able to avoid this error. I'll save and run this again. And yes, I think we've succeeded, but we're first going to have to check because we did all these other things to the file first. But now let's see if the file has all of this in it or if it just looks like our more names file. So if we come back, more names just has these 4. Then we read this, took that content, and we wrote to names, which now only has the 4 names once again, instead of all the extra Neils that we had previously added to this file. So I hope today's lesson has really helped you learn many different ways to work with files that will be useful for you in the future. And remember the R.A.W.X acronym, R.A.W.X, for read, append, write, and create. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.